Late October, 1886, Blackthorn Ranch. By the time the sun slipped behind the western ridge, Blackthorn Ranch already looked like a place that had surrendered to winter long before the season had arrived. The endless Wyoming prairie, once alive with green summer grass, had turned into a sea of brittle amber, stretching toward the distant mountains. A cold wind swept across the valley, carrying the dry whisper of dying grass through broken fence posts and empty corrals. Above it all, fresh snow clung to the mountain peaks, glowing beneath the last golden light of day, like a quiet warning. Winter was still miles away, but everyone living in the valley knew it was already coming. Silence had settled over the ranch in a way that felt unnatural. Ranches were supposed to echo with the sounds of horses, cattle, and men finishing another day's work. Blackthorn echoed with almost nothing. Two ranch hands struggled to drag the carcass of another dead cow toward a shallow trench near the far pasture, its heavy body carving a dark line through the dust. It was the 14th animal they had buried that month. Nobody spoke. After enough losses, grief became too familiar to waste words on. Caleb Thornton stood alone beside the fence, one weathered hand resting on the top rail, as he watched the men disappear into the fading light. At 37, he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had spent half his life working this land. Yet the deep lines around his eyes told another story, one of sleepless nights, unpaid debts, and decisions that no longer seemed to have good endings. The bank could wait until spring for its payment. Winter would not. If the herd continued to die, there would be nothing left for the bank to take anyway. Old Amos approached without a sound, stopping beside him as naturally as he had for nearly 20 years. "They're saying the creek's cursed now," the old foreman said quietly. Caleb never looked away from the pasture. "The creek isn't cursed. No." His eyes remained fixed on the cattle grazing beneath the evening sky. People don't lose their ranches because of curses. They lose them because someone makes money when they do. Amos said nothing after that. Experience had taught him that Caleb rarely spoke more than necessary. But whenever he did, there was usually a reason. A sudden shift in the wind drew Caleb's attention toward the narrow trail leading into the valley. At first he thought it might be another rider coming from town. Then he realized there was no horse, only 3 figures, walking slowly across the prairie. A woman, a young boy, and a small child cradled in her arms. Even from this distance, he could see the weight pressing on the woman's shoulders. She leaned into the wind as though every step demanded strength she no longer possessed. Nearly half a mile away, Mara Bell tightened her arms around little Lucy, whose forehead still burned with fever, despite the cool autumn air. The child slept fitfully against her shoulder, too exhausted even to cry. Beside them, 9-year-old Samuel struggled to keep pace, his worn boots scraping across the dry prairie grass. Every few moments, he glanced behind them, searching the empty horizon with the nervous habit he had never quite managed to lose. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "Mom," he hesitated, almost afraid of the answer. "Are they still looking for us?" For a single heartbeat, Mara closed her eyes. More than anything, she wanted to tell him no, that the fear was over, that they would never have to run again, that somewhere beyond the next hill waited a place they could finally call home. But 6 months of fleeing from one town to the next had taught her not to make promises she couldn't keep. Instead, she looked toward the lonely ranch standing against the fading sky. She had never heard its name. She had never planned to come here. Yet something inside her whispered that if hope still existed anywhere on the Wyoming frontier, it might be waiting behind that weathered fence. She forced herself to smile. "Keep walking," she said softly. Samuel nodded, and together they continued toward the ranch. never noticing the man watching them from the fence line. When Mara finally reached the wooden gate, her eyes swept across the frightened cattle, the anxious ranch hands, the empty corrals, and the worried ranchers standing before her. It took only a few seconds for her to recognize what everyone else had mistaken for the cruelty of an early winter. The cattle weren't dying because the weather had turned cold. They were dying because someone wanted them to. She met Caleb Thornton's cautious gaze, shifted Lucy a little higher in her arms, and spoke with a quiet certainty that surprised even herself. "Give my kids milk." The wind carried her words across the silent ranch before she finished. "And I'll save your ranch." For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The autumn wind swept through the ranch yard, carrying with it the scent of dust, damp hay, and the first hint of frost drifting down from the mountains. Somewhere inside the barn, a restless horse struck the wooden floor with a heavy hoof, while one of the ranch hands let out a quiet, doubtful laugh before turning away. To everyone watching, the stranger standing outside the gate looked like another desperate traveler hoping for charity. Only Caleb seemed to notice something different. He studied the woman carefully. Her dress had been worn almost colorless by months of travel, its hem stained with dried mud from countless roads. Loose strands of chestnut hair escaped beneath her bonnet, whipping across a face that looked far older than 31. Yet it wasn't her appearance that held his attention. It was her eyes. They weren't searching for sympathy. They weren't begging for mercy. They were studying the ranch itself, moving slowly from the cattle to the barns, the fence, the corrals, and finally to the distant pasture, as though she were already trying to understand why everything around her seemed to be falling apart. "You've got nerve," Caleb finally said. Mara's answer came without hesitation. "I've got hungry children." His eyes shifted toward the little girl sleeping against her shoulder. Lucy's cheeks were flushed with fever, and although she slept peacefully, every breath seemed just a little too shallow. Then he looked at Samuel. The boy had quietly placed himself half a step in front of his mother, despite being barely tall enough to reach her shoulder. His clothes were worn. His boots were nearly falling apart, and exhaustion weighed heavily on his young face. Yet there was something fiercely protective in the way he stood, as though he had decided long ago that keeping his mother and sister safe was now his responsibility. Caleb recognized that look immediately. He had seen it once before, every morning in his own mirror. "You said you'd save my ranch," he said evenly. "Suppose I let you through that gate. Suppose I give your children food, milk, and a roof tonight. What happens if you're wrong?" "We leave." "You don't have a wagon." "I know." "You don't have a horse." "I know." "You barely have enough money to survive another day." "I know." There was no anger in her voice, no attempt to bargain, and no trace of self-pity. She simply answered each question with the quiet honesty of someone who had already accepted every possible outcome. Old Amos stepped closer to Caleb. "Boss," he murmured, keeping his voice low, "she's carrying a sick little girl." "I can see that. And winter's nearly here." "I know." Amos fell silent. He understood that Caleb wasn't weighing whether the family deserved help. He was deciding whether Blackthorn Ranch could survive helping anyone at all. 3 strangers meant 3 more mouths to feed. And every sack of grain, every bucket of milk, and every piece of firewood already had to be counted. Still, one thought refused to leave Caleb's mind. Most desperate people looked at the house first. This woman had looked at the cattle. That troubled him far more than her impossible promise. At last, he reached for the wooden latch and pulled the gate open. "You'll have 30 days. Relief flickered across Mara's face, though she quickly hid it. "Your children will have milk every morning. You'll stay in the old bunkhouse beside the calving barn. and you'll eat with the ranch hands." He paused before adding, "When the first real snow reaches this valley, our agreement ends." "If I haven't helped," Mara replied quietly. "If you haven't proved you belong here." She nodded once. "That's fair." Caleb stepped aside, allowing the three of them to enter Blackthorn Ranch for the first time. As Mara walked through the gate, something unfamiliar caught her attention. A faint sour smell drifted across the yard, almost hidden beneath the scent of fresh hay and cold earth. She slowed without realizing it, letting her eyes wander across the nearest group of cattle. Several animals stood with their heads hanging unusually low. One breathed faster than the others, while another ignored the hay piled in the feeder altogether. None of them showed the stiff movements or frost damage she would have expected if cold weather were truly the problem. Curiosity overcame exhaustion. She stepped closer and quietly crouched beside the nearest cow, careful not to frighten it. Without touching the animal, she observed its breathing, its posture, the moisture around its nose, the condition of its coat, and the way it shifted its weight from one leg to another. Nearly a full minute passed before she rose again. Behind her, Caleb watched every movement. "See something?" he asked. Mara kept her eyes on the herd a moment longer before answering. "Yes." "What is it?" She turned slowly to face him. "They aren't dying because winter is coming." The words settled over the ranch as quietly as the evening wind. Caleb's expression grew more guarded. "Then why are they dying?" Mara looked back across the pasture where the fading October sunlight washed over the restless herd. For the first time since arriving, uncertainty crossed her face. "I don't know yet," she admitted. Then she looked directly at Caleb. "But I know this much." Her voice remained calm, though every word carried quiet conviction. "You're looking in the wrong direction." The first frost arrived before sunrise, covering the pastures with a thin layer of white that shimmered like scattered glass beneath the pale morning light. Somewhere beyond the hills, a lone coyote called across the valley before the sound faded into silence. Blackthorn Ranch was awake again, but it carried the same heavy mood that had settled over it for weeks. Every new morning felt less like a beginning and more like another day borrowed from an uncertain future. Mara had been awake long before anyone else. Lucy was still asleep beneath 3 borrowed blankets, her fever finally beginning to break. After a warm meal and a full night's rest, Samuel sat quietly beside the little iron stove, finishing the last piece of cornbread left from supper. He watched his mother lace her boots without asking many questions. During the past 6 months, he had learned that whenever Mara became this quiet, she was thinking. "I'm going outside," she said gently. "Stay with your sister." Samuel looked up. "What are you looking for?" A faint smile crossed her face. "Answers. Outside." The same cow Mara had noticed the evening before still stood alone near the edge of the pasture. It wasn't lying down, yet it had separated itself from the rest of the herd, lowering its head as though even standing required effort. That detail bothered Mara immediately. Sick cattle usually stayed close together. Animals that isolated themselves often carried a different kind of problem, one that couldn't be blamed on cold weather alone. She approached slowly, allowing the cow to grow accustomed to her presence before stepping closer. Caleb noticed her from across the yard while tightening the straps on a saddle. Without making it obvious, he abandoned the task and quietly watched. He expected confidence. What he didn't expect was patience. Mara examined the animal without rushing. She counted each breath, studied its eyes, checked the color of its gums, and crouched to inspect the hay scattered beneath its feet. The outer strands were dry enough, but she wasn't ready to draw conclusions. Finally, she rested the back of her hand against the cow's neck before turning toward the nearest watering trough. "It's dehydrated," she said softly. Caleb frowned. "There's water in every trough." "I know." She looked back at the cow. But having water nearby doesn't mean she's drinking. The distinction seemed almost too simple. Yet something in Mara's calm certainty made Caleb hesitate before questioning her again. She asked for 2 clean buckets and carried fresh spring water herself from the small barrel beside the ranch house, mixing warm water with a handful of mineral salt. She placed the bucket in front of the weakened animal and quietly stepped away. The ranch hands watched with folded arms, exchanging doubtful glances. One of them muttered that she was wasting perfectly good salt on a cow that would probably be dead before sunset for nearly a minute. Nothing happened. The cow simply stood there, breathing heavily while the cold wind stirred the grass around its legs. Then, almost imperceptibly, it lifted its head. One slow step became another. Its nose reached toward the bucket, hesitated for a moment, and finally touched the water. It drank only a little, but it drank willingly. Mara let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Keep the others away from her today," she said. "Give her time." Caleb folded his arms. "That's all you're going to do? For now? No medicine?" She met his eyes without the slightest trace of defensiveness. "I don't know exactly what I'm treating yet. Guessing may comfort people, but it kills livestock." The answer stayed with Caleb long after she walked away. For the first time since strangers had begun offering advice about his ranch, someone had admitted what they didn't know before claiming to know everything else. The following morning, the cow was still alive, weak, thin, and unsteady but standing. Old Amos watched in silence as the animal wandered back toward the herd and managed several mouthfuls of hay before settling comfortably beside the others. "I'll be damned," he whispered. No one celebrated. Ranch life had taught them never to celebrate too early. Still, something changed that morning. The men spoke a little louder. Their shoulders seemed a little lighter. Hope, however fragile, had found its way back into Blackthorn Ranch. 3 days passed beneath increasingly colder skies. Lucy's laughter returned to the bunkhouse, and little Emma quietly began leaving small treasures outside the door each morning: a polished stone from the creek, a bright ribbon, an apple she insisted tasted sweeter than the others. Samuel noticed every gift, but his attention kept drifting elsewhere. He had started following Caleb, never close enough to be seen, just close enough to watch. He watched Caleb inspect fences before dawn, pause to study hoofprints pressed into damp soil, and stand motionless for long stretches as though the land itself were whispering secrets only he could hear. Samuel didn't understand what Caleb was seeing, but one thing became increasingly clear. The rancher noticed things long before anyone else did. That afternoon, while checking the feed barn, Mara reached into one of the largest hay bales and immediately frowned. The outside felt perfectly dry, exactly as it should. But when she pushed her hand deeper into the tightly packed bundle, her fingers touched something cold and damp hidden near the center. She pulled the bale apart. A sour smell escaped almost immediately. The outer layers had concealed the damage perfectly, while the middle had already begun to rot. It wasn't enough to ruin the entire harvest. It was just enough to slowly weaken hundreds of cattle over the course of weeks. Mara stared at the spoiled hay without moving. This wasn't carelessness. It wasn't bad weather. Someone had made sure the rot stayed hidden until it was too late to notice. She looked toward the pasture where the herd grazed beneath the fading afternoon sun, and a quiet certainty settled over her. This ranch wasn't losing a fight against winter. Someone had started the fight long before winter ever arrived. The 5th morning dawned colder than any before it. A pale mist drifted above the creek that wound through Blackthorn Ranch. It was the kind of morning ranchers usually welcomed. Cold weather alone had never frightened men who understood winter. What frightened them was losing cattle for reasons they couldn't explain. Blackthorn had stopped burying an animal every day. Yet the herd still wasn't right. Several cows remained weaker than they should have been, drinking less, wandering farther from the others, and growing thinner despite the fresh hay Mara had separated from the spoiled bales. The rotten feed had explained part of the problem, but only part. Mara could feel it. Every answer they uncovered seemed to reveal another question waiting beneath it. She stood outside the barn watching the cattle drift toward the western pasture when Caleb walked beside her, his eyes fixed on the narrow ribbon of water glimmering beyond the grass. "If someone hid rotten hay," she said quietly. "They expected the cattle to survive long enough for no one to notice." Caleb nodded once. They'd need another way to keep weakening them. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The creek continued to flow as peacefully as it always had. Finally, Caleb reached for his hat. "I'm going to the water." Mara looked at him. "You think it's there?" "I don't know." His gaze never left the distant stream. But the land usually tells the truth before people do. Samuel happened to hear the conversation while carrying a bundle of split firewood across the yard. He set it down without a sound. "Can I come?" Caleb studied the boy for a moment. "You stay behind me." Samuel tried not to smile. "Yes, sir." It was the first time Caleb had invited him anywhere. The creek looked innocent enough. Crystal clear water slipped over rounded stones, whispering beneath overhanging willow branches, exactly as it must have done for years. One of the ranch hands dipped both hands into the current, splashed water across his face, then shrugged. "Looks clean." "It is," Mara answered. She knelt beside the bank and let the cold water run across her fingers. There was no strange odor, no unusual color, nothing that suggested poison. Samuel frowned. "Then why are we here?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched near the muddy shoreline and rested one gloved hand lightly against the ground. He wasn't looking for a single track. He was reading the land. His eyes moved slowly across the creek bank, the way another man might read the pages of a well-worn book. A bent blade of grass. Fresh mud where the ground should have been dry. A pebble lying upside down, its clean underside still damp. None of those things meant anything alone. Tukvir. They formed a story. Samuel stared at the earth. To him, it looked like ordinary dirt. To Caleb, someone had walked across it only hours earlier. He pointed toward a horseshoe print. "How many riders came this way yesterday?" The ranch hand frowned. "None." Caleb nodded. "I didn't think so." Samuel leaned closer. "How do you know it's new?" "The frost." Samuel blinked. Caleb traced the edge of the print with one finger. The older tracks filled with frost before sunrise. He moved to another impression several feet away. This one broke the frost. Only then did Samuel notice the thin white crystals scattered around the hoofprint, instead of finceated. "It's fresh," he whispered. Caleb smiled faintly. "Very fresh." They followed the trail downstream. At first Samuel saw nothing except scattered tracks disappearing through the grass. Then Caleb stopped beside a cluster of willow roots growing along the narrowest bend of the creek. There, Mara stepped beside him. A rough wooden plank had been driven beneath the surface of the water, nearly invisible beneath drifting leaves and muddy silt. It didn't block the creek completely. It didn't need to. It simply slowed the current. Water pooled against the bank instead of flowing freely, creating shallow pockets where algae had already begun to spread. Mara knelt immediately. She studied the muddy water for several moments before looking back at Caleb. No poison. But stagnant water breeds disease. She looked downstream where dozens of cattle gathered to drink every afternoon. If they drank here every day, they'd grow weaker. Caleb finished. Neither of them reached for the plank right away. Instead, they looked at one another. The spoiled hay. Now the creek. Two different methods. One purpose. Caleb finally pulled the plank free. The current surged forward almost instantly, washing away the stagnant pool as though the creek itself had been waiting to breathe again. The land remembered. Caleb said quietly, "It always does." 5 more days slipped by beneath steadily darkening skies. The cattle improved little by little. Lucy's fever disappeared completely, and Emma could often be found outside the bunkhouse, waiting for her new friend to wake each morning. Samuel still followed Caleb whenever he could, though he tried very hard to pretend he wasn't. On the 10th day, just after sunrise, a frightened shout echoed across the north pasture. "Mr. Thornton!" Every ranch hand turned at once. Half a dozen cattle were already wandering beyond the boundary fence. Caleb reached the pasture first. One glance was enough to stop him in his tracks. The heavy cedar posts still stood firmly in the ground. The rails hadn't snapped. Nothing had been broken by frightened cattle. He knelt beside the nearest support and brushed away a thin layer of loose dirt. Fresh scrape marks caught the morning light. Someone had used an iron pry bar. Every wooden peg had been lifted out carefully, one by one. Old Amos removed his hat. "I've repaired fences my whole life," he said quietly. "Wind doesn't pull pegs." Mara walked slowly along the damaged section, counting each missing support. Not random, not careless, deliberate. She stopped beside Caleb. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The hay, the creek, now the fence. 3 different attacks. 3 different methods. One unmistakable pattern. Caleb slowly rose to his feet, his eyes sweeping across the empty hills beyond Blackthorn Ranch. Whoever had done this was long gone, but the ranch had finally answered the question that had haunted him since Mara first walked through the gate. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a harsh winter. Someone had come to Blackthorn Ranch with a single purpose, not to steal it, not to rob it, to make sure it died. The 11th morning arrived wrapped in quiet. Frost still covered the pasture before sunrise, but Blackthorn Ranch no longer felt like a place waiting for disaster. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney above the bunkhouse. Horses stamped patiently in their stalls. And somewhere near the barn, old Amos whistled an old trail song that none of the younger hands recognized. It wasn't that the ranch had been saved. The mystery surrounding the sabotage remained unsolved, and winter crept closer every day. But for the first time in months, life had begun to return in small, ordinary ways, the kind people rarely noticed until they had almost disappeared. Inside the bunkhouse, Mara poured warm milk into 3 tin cups while Lucy sat bundled beneath a blanket, swinging her feet happily above the floor. Her fever had vanished completely, leaving only the healthy impatience of a 5-year-old, eager to be outside again. Samuel accepted his cup with a quiet nod, but before taking a single drink, he glanced toward his sister to make certain she had hers first. Mara pretended not to notice. She had watched him do the same thing every morning since Daniel died. A gentle knock sounded at the door. When Mara opened it, Emma stood outside with both hands hidden behind her back. "I brought something," she whispered. Lucy smiled immediately. Emma slowly revealed a small rag doll, stitched from scraps of faded blue fabric. One button served as an eye, while the other had been replaced with a tiny knot of black thread. The doll leaned awkwardly to one side, clearly sewn by a child's unsteady hands. "I made her," Emma said, suddenly uncertain. "Well, Miss Abigail helped me with the arms." Lucy accepted the doll as though someone had placed treasure in her hands. She hugged it tightly against her chest without saying a word. Emma's worried expression melted into a grin. Mara felt something tighten gently inside her heart. Children, she thought, somehow always remembered how to begin again. Later that afternoon, a cold wind swept down from the mountains. carrying with it the unmistakable promise of early snow. Lucy stepped outside without thinking, still wearing the thin coat she had arrived in. Caleb happened to see her crossing the yard. He stopped. The little coat barely reached her wrists anymore, and the fabric was so worn that daylight shone through places where it had been patched more than once. Without saying anything, Caleb turned toward the tack room. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a small wool coat, carefully folded across one arm. "It was Emma's," he said quietly. "She outgrew it last winter." Mara looked at the coat, but didn't reach for it. "I can't. You aren't taking charity." His voice remained calm. "You're borrowing winter." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Mara accepted the coat with both hands, brushing invisible dust from the sleeve before helping Lucy into it. It fit almost perfectly. Lucy stretched her arms, spun once in the yard, and laughed a bright, carefree laugh that drifted across the ranch like birdsong after a long storm. Caleb watched from the porch. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd heard children laughing here. That evening, supper felt different. The ranch hands shifted along the long wooden table without being asked, making room for Mara, Samuel, Lucy, and Emma, as though they had always belonged there. Someone passed Samuel an extra biscuit before he could ask. Old Amos poured more milk into Lucy's cup when he thought no one was looking. Emma insisted the rag doll needed its own place beside her bowl, and even the older cowboy smiled instead of complaining. For a little while, Blackthorn Ranch forgot its troubles. The room was warm. The lantern light glowed softly against the pine walls. Outside, winter waited beyond the windows. Inside, a family was beginning to take shape. Much later, after the children had fallen asleep and the ranch had settled into silence, Caleb found Mara standing alone beneath the stars, her gaze fixed on the dark road leading east. He joined her without speaking. The cold night stretched quietly between them until Caleb finally broke the silence. He didn't ask about the ranch. He didn't ask about the sabotage. He looked toward the empty road and asked only one question. "How long have you been running?" Mara's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl, long enough to know that stopping can be more dangerous than running. Caleb turned toward her. "Who are you afraid of?" For a moment, Mara looked ready to answer. Her lips parted, but the words never came. Somewhere inside the house, Lucy cried out in her sleep. Mara immediately turned toward the door. "Not tonight, Caleb." She left him beneath the stars with more questions than before. By noon the next day, one of those questions rode through Blackthorn's front gate. Silas Vane arrived beneath a ski the color of old iron. 2 men followed him, both dressed too neatly for ranch work, and carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of men who expected doors to open before they knocked. Silas wore a charcoal overcoat, polished boots, and a pale gray hat untouched by dust. He looked less like a traveler who had crossed Wyoming, and more like a man who believed the territory itself should move a scene for him. Caleb met them in the yard. "You Thornton?" "Depends who's asking." Silas smiled as though he'd expected the answer. "Silas Vane, Continental Passage Company." He removed one leather glove and offered his hand. Caleb looked at it, but didn't take it. Silas lowered his arm without embarrassment. "I've come to discuss the purchase of Blackthorn Ranch." "Then you wasted the ride." "Perhaps." Silas glanced toward the barn, the fences, and the cattle beyond them. "But properties have a way of changing value when winter approaches, especially properties already suffering losses." Caleb's expression remained still, though every word struck too close to the truth. Silas continued in the patient tone of a man explaining something inevitable. "Continental Passage is expanding west. This valley offers the cleanest route through the foothills. Selling now would spare you another season of debt. Dead cattle, and disappointment. Before Caleb could answer, the bunkhouse door opened. Mara stepped outside carrying an empty milk pail. The moment she saw the visitors, all color left her face. Nicholas noticed. For the first time, his pleasant smile became genuine, not warm. Pasty. He turned fully toward her. Mrs. Bell. The milk pail slipped from Mara's fingers and struck the frozen ground with a hollow clang. Caleb looked from her to Silas. No one on Blackthorn Ranch had introduced her. Silas replaced his gloves slowly. I wondered how far you might get. Mara's hand moved instinctively toward Lucy, who stood just inside the doorway wearing Emma's old wool coat. Samuel stepped in front of his sister before anyone told him to. Silas watched the movement with mild amusement. You've chosen an unfortunate place to stop running. Caleb moved between them. You've made your offer. Now leave. The smile disappeared from Silas's face. This ranch will belong to Continental Passage. Mr. Thornton, the only question is whether you sell it while it still has value or lose everything first. He turned his horse toward the road. As he passed Mara, he tipped his hat. My condolences about Daniel. Then he rode away. That night, the children slept in Caleb's house instead of the bunkhouse. Emma remained beside Lucy, clutching the rag doll between them, while Samuel lay awake near the door, with one hand curled around the tall knife Daniel had once given him. Downstairs, Mara sat before the dying fire with Caleb across from her. The leather satchel rested in her lap. She had guarded it through rain, hunger, and every mile since Missouri. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she opened the brass clasp and removed a weathered ledger filled with numbers, land descriptions, initials, and symbols written in Daniel's hand. My husband worked as a survey clerk for Continental Passage, she began. At first, he believed they were building a railroad. Then he discovered they were doing something else. The company had identified ranches, farms, and water rights lying along its proposed route. When owners refused to sell, livestock became sick, barns burned, mortgages were purchased by strangers, and families were driven from land they had held for generations. Afterward, Continental Passage bought everything for almost nothing. Daniel copied the transactions, the dates, the payments, the names of hired men. He thought the ledger could expose them. Mara said, but before he could reach a federal marshal, they found him. Her voice faltered only once. They killed him and called it a robbery. Caleb looked toward the ceiling where her children slept. And you've carried the evidence ever since. Only part of it. Mara turned several pages until she reached the final coded entry. One name appeared beside a road marked through the Wyoming foothills. Blackthorn. Daniel's notes showed every property along the planned passage had already been purchased, abandoned, or destroyed. Every property except one. Mara lifted her eyes to Caleb. Blackthorn isn't simply another ranch they want. Outside, the wind pressed hard against the windows, making the glass tremble in its frame. It's the last piece of land standing between Continental Passage and the entire valley. The morning after Silas Vane's visit, Blackthorn Ranch no longer felt like the refuge it had been only a day before. Heavy clouds rolled down from the mountains, turning the Wyoming ski the color of cold steel, while a bitter wind swept across the pastures, carrying the unmistakable promise of winter. Even the cattle seemed uneasy, bunching together instead of spreading across the field inside the barn. However, life struggled to hold on to its ordinary rhythm. Samuel hauled fresh water to the horses, determined to prove he could work alongside the grown men. Emma and Lucy chased a newborn calf that kept stealing scraps of hay, their laughter echoing through the rafters. Mara watched them from the doorway, with a faint smile that never quite reached her eyes. For the first time since reaching Blackthorn, She found herself wondering if happiness had simply arrived too soon. The peaceful morning shattered when one of the ranch hands discovered someone hiding beneath the hayloft. Caleb climbed the ladder first and found a young man no older than 20, filthy, exhausted, and trembling from equal parts hunger and fear. The stranger offered no resistance as he climbed down. "My name is Harlan," he said quietly. "I worked for Continental Passage." No one spoke. Harlan rubbed his shaking hands together before continuing. "Mr. Vane sent me here weeks ago. I was supposed to watch the ranch. Nothing more." Caleb studied him carefully. "And the poisoned creek, the broken fence. I didn't do those things." Harlan swallowed hard. "I only reported what I saw." His eyes drifted toward Mara. "But he doesn't need reports anymore." Mara felt the blood drain from her face. "What does that mean?" Harlan hesitated, as though saying the words aloud might somehow make them more dangerous. "He knows you're here." Silence settled over the barn. Then Harlan looked through the open doorway, where Lucy and Emma were playing outside, while Samuel helped Amos repair a wagon wheel. "Mr. Vane said chasing grown people wastes time." His voice fell almost to a whisper. He said, "If Mrs. Bell won't come willingly." Harlan lowered his eyes. "They'll take the children instead." The words lingered in Mara's mind long after everyone returned to work. Every laugh from the yard suddenly sounded fragile. Every shadow seemed longer than it should have been. She watched Samuel lifting sacks far too heavy for a boy his age, and Lucy proudly showing Emma her rag doll. And a terrible certainty settled over her heart. Silas wasn't hunting Daniel's ledger anymore. He was hunting the people Mara loved. If she remained at Blackthorn, Caleb's family would become targets simply because they had shown kindness to a stranger. By the time the sun disappeared behind the hills, she had already made her decision. She packed Daniel's ledger inside the old leather satchel, folded Lucy's spare dress beside it, and waited until every light in the ranch house had gone dark. Before dawn, she would leave without saying goodbye. She had barely opened the front door when Caleb's voice stopped her. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Mara kept her back to him. "I have to." "You think he'll follow you?" "He will. And if he doesn't?" She closed her eyes. "I can't risk finding out." Caleb stepped onto the porch beside Steder. The lantern above them swayed gently as the wind grew colder, casting soft light across the weathered wood beneath their feet. "You didn't bring danger here," he said quietly. "Pielis did. But he'll keep hurting people because of me. He'll keep hurting people no matter where you go." For the first time since Daniel died, Mara's voice broke. "I couldn't save my husband." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I won't stand here and watch another family lose someone they love." Caleb reached up and gently brushed the tear away with his thumb. "You've been running ever since the day Daniel died." She looked into his eyes. "So have I." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Mara took the smallest step forward. Caleb met her halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, hesitant, and heartbreakingly brief, carrying more comfort than passion, as though two wounded souls had finally admitted they no longer wished to face the darkness alone. When they slowly pulled apart, the first snowflake landed on Mara's sleeve, another settled on Caleb's hat. Within moments, the sky opened, and the season's first snowfall drifted silently across Blackthorn Ranch, blanketing the fields, the fences, and every scar autumn had left behind. The quiet lasted only seconds. Raised voices echoed from the direction of the bunkhouse. Amos was leading Harlan inside before the storm grew worse, but the frightened young man had suddenly begun struggling, trying desperately to explain something. The wind carried most of his words away before they reached the porch. Only one sentence survived. "She did exactly what you paid her to." Caleb turned instinctively toward the sound. The rest disappeared beneath the rising wind and the falling snow. He had heard only half a sentence, but sometimes half the truth was enough to become a lie. The first snow continued falling through the night, covering Blackthorn Ranch in a blanket of quiet white. By morning, every fence rail, every rooftop, and every hoof print had disappeared beneath fresh powder, as though winter had tried to erase the troubles of the past week. But inside the ranch house, nothing had been forgotten. Caleb had barely slept. Harlan's unfinished words echoed through his mind, again and again. She did exactly what you paid her to. The sentence refused to leave him. Before sunrise, unable to silence the growing doubt, he walked to the small room Mara had been using. She wasn't there. Her satchel lay open on the bed, half-packed, and beside it rested Daniel Bell's worn ledger. Caleb had never intended to touch another man's secrets, yet the book had fallen open to a folded sheet tucked between its pages. It was an old survey map of the valley. Strange symbols marked creeks, ridgelines, and ranch boundaries in dark pencil. Across the bottom, beneath several coded notes, was Daniel Bell's unmistakable signature. Caleb frowned. The markings circled Blackthorn again and again, while a thick line traced the future railroad route straight through the center of his land. To a tired mind already poisoned by doubt, the page looked less like evidence and more like careful planning. Harlan's words suddenly seemed to fit too well. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Mara standing in the doorway. Snowflakes still clung to her coat, and the leather satchel hung over one shoulder. "You read it," she said softly. "I found it." Neither of them raised their voice. Neither needed to. Caleb held up the map. "You knew my ranch was part of this." "Yes. You knew before you ever arrived." "I did." He searched her face for the answer he wanted to hear. Instead, all he found was sadness. "So why didn't you tell me?" Mara lowered her eyes. "Because the moment you knew the truth, you would become part of Daniel's fight." Caleb looked again at the map. The symbols, the signatures, the coded markings covering his land. And maybe I already was. For the first time since she arrived at Blackthorn, there was a distance between them that neither could cross. Mara stepped forward and gently took the ledger from his hands. "I never came here to use you. I want to believe that, but you can't." Caleb said nothing. His silence answered for him. Mara nodded once, accepting what words could not repair. She walked upstairs without another sentence. A few minutes later, she returned wearing her traveling coat, the satchel resting against her shoulder once more. Samuel carried a small blanket roll. While Lucy clutched Emma's rag doll tightly against her chest, Emma stared at them in confusion. "Why are you packing?" Lucy looked toward her mother, but received no answer. Emma's voice trembled. "You're not leaving, are you?" Mara knelt until they were eye level. "I have to." "No." Emma threw her arms around Mara's neck, crying so suddenly that even Samuel looked away. "You promised you'd stay until spring." Mara held the little girl as though she wished time itself would stop. "If they find me here," her voice broke, "Emma becomes next." The room fell silent. Even Caleb felt the words strike deeper than anything she had said before. Mara gently kissed Emma's forehead before placing the rag doll back into Lucy's arms. She stood, took Samuel's hand, and walked toward the front door. Caleb watched every step, wanting to stop her, wanting to tell her not to go. Yet the doubt inside him had stolen the certainty he needed only hours earlier. By the time he finally reached the porch, Mara and the children were already walking into the endless white snowfall. He called her name once. She never turned around. Morning had barely broken when Mara reached the abandoned line shack Daniel had once marked on his map. hidden among a stand of wind-twisted pines, several miles from Blackthorn. It was little more than 4 rough walls and a leaking roof. But it offered one priceless advantage: it couldn't be seen from the trail below. Lucy was exhausted after the long walk through the storm, wrapped in blankets beside the small stove. She fell asleep almost immediately, still holding Emma's rag doll against her chest. Mara watched her daughter for a long moment before turning to Samuel. The boy had hardly spoken since leaving the ranch, but she recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same stubborn determination Daniel had worn whenever he believed he alone could fix a problem. Mara knelt in front of him. "We stay here until dark." Samuel nodded. "No matter what happens, I promise." Mara believed him. She shouldn't have. Back at Blackthorn Ranch, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something about Daniel's ledger still didn't fit. If Mara had truly intended to betray him, why leave the book behind? Why protect Emma? Why walk away instead of bargaining with Silas? The questions refused to leave him. While searching the room once more, he noticed something he had overlooked the first time. A narrow strip of thread hung from the inside seam of Lucy's old coat, the coat Emma had worn before giving it to her. Caleb carefully loosened the stitches and reached inside. Nothing. Only a few loose fibers remained. Someone had hidden something there, and someone had already taken it. So Samuel had. While Mara gathered firewood outside the cabin, the boy quietly removed the folded page from inside his shirt. He had discovered it sewn into Lucy's old coat days earlier, and hidden it without telling anyone. He hadn't understood Daniel's coded writing, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Caleb saw this page, he would know his mother had been telling the truth. Samuel slipped out the back of the cabin before Mara returned. The snow had eased, leaving only a light wind across the valley. Blackthorn wasn't impossibly far away. He could reach it before sunset. He never saw the rider waiting among the trees. A gloved hand grabbed him before he could cry out. The folded page slipped from his fingers unnoticed as the stranger pulled him onto a waiting horse. Near sunset, Mara arrived alone at the old bridge Daniel had marked years before. It stretched across a narrow gorge where the frozen creek disappeared beneath thick sheets of ice. The place was deserted. Exactly as the note had instructed, Silas emerged from the opposite side with 2 mounted men behind him. "You came alone." "I did." "Where's the ledger?" Mara held his gaze. "You'll never have it." Silas smiled. "I wasn't asking about the ledger." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Mara's face. Silas slowly removed a small leather glove and looked almost amused. "I was asking about your son." The world seemed to stop, miles away. Caleb rode through the fresh snow, following a line of small footprints, leading away from the hidden cabin. They disappeared beneath a cluster of pines, where something white caught his eye against the frozen ground. He climbed down from his horse. It wasn't snow. It was a folded page. Daniel's handwriting covered both sides. Caleb opened it carefully. There were no railroad plans, no agreement, no payment records involving Mara. Instead, Daniel had written detailed instructions explaining the symbols in the ledger, followed by one final note. "If anything happens to me, never let Continental Passage reach Blackthorn. Caleb Thornton must know the truth. He is the only rancher who can stop them. Trust him, even if he cannot trust you yet." Caleb read the words twice, then a third time. The weight of the past 2 days crashed over him all at once. He had doubted the wrong person. He had let her walk away. And now Samuel was gone. By the time Caleb reached Blackthorn Ranch again, the sky had disappeared behind a wall of snow. The wind howled across the valley with a force he had not seen in years, swallowing fence, trails, and landmarks beneath endless sheets of white. Amos met him at the stable before he could even dismount. "You found Samuel?" Caleb answered by handing him Daniel Bell's missing page. I found the truth. He didn't waste another second explaining. If Samuel left the cabin, he won't stay on the trail. Amos frowned. In this storm, nobody can follow tracks. Caleb looked toward the white hills beyond the ranch. No. He tightened the saddle. But the land still remembers. The wind erased footprints almost as quickly as they were made. Yet Caleb wasn't searching for footprints anymore. Daniel had once read maps. Caleb read the land itself. He watched the direction of snow piling against sagebrush, the broken tops of frozen grass bending beneath fresh weight, and the narrow gaps where drifting snow curled around buried rocks instead of covering them completely. Every small change revealed how horses had passed before the storm gathered its full strength. 3 riders, Caleb murmured. 1 horse carrying extra weight. Amos stared at the nearly invisible signs. You can actually see that. Caleb urged his horse forward. I don't see it. He narrowed his eyes toward the valley below. I remember how this land breathes. The trail bent toward the abandoned rail grade Daniel had marked on the map. Exactly where Silas would force someone to come, at the frozen bridge. Mara stood surrounded by drifting snow, while Silas sat calmly in the saddle only yards away. Samuel knelt beside one of the railroad workers, his wrists tied with rough rope, but otherwise unharmed. Lucy was nowhere to be seen. Silas smiled. I'll give you one last chance. The ledger dies with me. It isn't the ledger I want anymore. His eyes drifted toward Samuel. I want obedience. Before Mara could answer, a long whistle echoed through the canyon. Every head turned, far below. An aging freight locomotive crawled along the unfinished rail line, pushing a single supply car toward the mountain pass. Daniel had once shown Mara how temporary construction engines stopped at every water tower to refill their boilers. She had noticed one thing when she arrived. The switch beside the bridge had never been locked. While Silas watched the approaching engine, Mara moved. She lunged toward the frozen switch lever with every ounce of strength she had left and threw her weight against it. The rusted iron groaned, then snapped into place. The locomotive, no longer following the main line, thundered onto the unfinished siding, directly beneath the bridge. Steam exploded upward in a deafening white cloud that swallowed the entire gorge. The horses panicked. One of Silas's men was thrown from the saddle. Another lost hold of Samuel's rope. Samuel rolled free and disappeared into the blinding steam before anyone could catch him. At that same instant, Caleb burst through the storm. He heard Samuel before he saw him. Mr. Thornton. The frightened voice came from somewhere inside the cloud of steam. Caleb threw himself from the saddle and followed the sound. Ignoring the freezing spray that coated his face, he found Samuel tangled beneath a broken timber, pulled him free, and shoved him toward Amos, who had arrived only moments beyond. Take him. What about Mara? Caleb was already running through the swirling steam. He spotted Silas dragging Mara toward his horse while reaching for the revolver at his belt. Let her go. Silas turned too late. Caleb slammed into him with enough force to send both men crashing into the snow. They struggled across the frozen ground as the frightened horses scattered in every direction. Silas managed to draw the revolver halfway before Caleb drove his fist into the man's jaw. The weapon disappeared beneath the snow. Dazed, Silas stumbled backward toward the edge of the unfinished embankment. The frozen earth beneath his boots gave way without warning. He grabbed desperately at empty air, then vanished into the white canyon below. No one moved. Only the wind answered. Mama! The cry came from beneath the bridge. Mara spun around. Lucy emerged from beneath the abandoned maintenance platform, where Mara had hidden her before walking to the meeting alone. The little girl ran straight into her mother's arms. Sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, Samuel reached them a heartbeat later. wrapping both arms around Mara as though afraid she might disappear again. For several seconds, none of them spoke. Caleb simply watched. The family he had nearly lost was whole again. The storm, however, was only beginning. Snow now fell sideways, and visibility had shrunk to little more than a horse's length. "We have to move," Amos shouted. "No one survives out here after dark." Every trail had vanished. Every landmark had disappeared. The valley had become a world of white. Caleb slowly looked across the drifting snow, then lifted his eyes toward the ridgeline. He watched how the wind curled around the western cliffs instead of the eastern slope. He noticed where the snow lay smooth and where hidden currents carved long ribbons across its surface beneath the storm. The land was still speaking. He smiled faintly. "I know the way." Mara looked at him. "You can actually find home in this." Caleb reached for her hand. "I don't follow the trail." He gently squeezed her fingers. "I follow the land." Holding Samuel close and with Lucy riding safely before Amos in the saddle, the little group disappeared into the heart of the blizzard, trusting the only man who could still read the mountain when the mountain itself had vanished. The blizzard finally loosened its grip sometime before dawn, but Blackthorn Ranch had paid a terrible price for surviving the night. Snow lay piled against the barns almost to the windows. One section of the north fence had vanished beneath drifts taller than a man, and the weight of frozen snow had forced the cattle into the lower pasture, where frightened animals pressed against weakened rails that could collapse at any moment. The roof of the calving barn sagged under the strain, its heavy beams groaning each time the wind returned. Ranch hands moved from building to building in exhausted silence, knowing they were no longer racing winter alone. They were racing time. If the barn failed before the livestock could be moved, Blackthorn would lose nearly everything it had left. Caleb insisted on helping before anyone could stop him. The fight with Silas had left one shoulder badly injured, and every movement sent pain across his chest. But he refused to stay inside while his ranch struggled to survive. He had barely climbed onto the barn roof with two of the men when a hidden layer of ice gave way beneath his boots. The timber cracked. Snow slid downward like an avalanche. Caleb shoved one ranch hand clear before the roof partially collapsed beneath him. He fell hard onto the wagon below, disappearing beneath broken boards and frozen hay. By the time Amos and the others pulled him free, his shoulder had been dislocated. 2 ribs were likely broken, and every attempt to stand left him fighting for breath. "You stay down," Amos ordered. Caleb tried to protest. "The cattle. We'll lose them if nobody takes charge." Before another word could be spoken, Mara stepped forward. "I will." Every face turned toward her. She wasn't a rancher. She wasn't even from Wyoming. But during the past weeks, she had watched everything. She had learned where the feed was stored, which gates connected the winter pasture, how Caleb organized the hands, and how every person on the ranch trusted one another when orders were clear. She didn't hesitate. "Move every calf into the machine shed first," she called. "Use the south lane. The snow is shallower there because the cottonwoods break the wind. Amos, take 4 men and cut an opening through the drift before the cattle panic. Leave the heavy wagons where they are. They'll only sink. Harness the draft horses instead. Emma, stay with Lucy inside the house. Samuel, you're with me." No one questioned her. They simply moved. For the next several hours, Blackthorn became a single heartbeat. Ranch hands broke frozen gates with axes. Samuel carried ropes from team to team without being asked twice. Emma kept frightened calves calm with handfuls of hay, while Lucy followed close behind, determined to help however a 6-year-old could. Mara seemed to be everywhere at once, calming frightened horses, directing wagons through narrow passages, and making impossible decisions before anyone else realized they needed to be made. More than once, Caleb watched from the porch, unable to join them, and saw his own quiet leadership reflected in her. By late afternoon, the last of the cattle crossed safely into the sheltered pasture. Moments later, the weakened calving barn gave one final groan before the roof collapsed completely beneath the weight of the snow. A cloud of white powder burst into the air, followed by absolute silence. If they had waited even 5 more minutes, half the herd would have died inside. Amos slowly removed his hat. "We made it." Mara finally allowed herself to breathe. She turned toward the porch where Caleb stood with one arm bound tightly against his chest. Their eyes met across the snowy yard, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Caleb gave the smallest nod, one filled with gratitude, admiration, and something deeper than either of them had yet found the courage to name. "You kept Blackthorn alive," he said quietly. Mara smiled through tired eyes. "No." She looked across the ranch Daniel had died trying to protect. "I simply kept a promise." And for the first time since she had arrived at Blackthorn Ranch, she realized it was no longer only Daniel's promise she had fulfilled. It was Caleb's future she had saved. 2. Spring returned to the valley, one quiet morning, almost as if winter had simply grown tired of holding on. Snowmelt filled the creeks with clear water. Fresh grass spread across the pastures, and the cottonwoods surrounding Blackthorn Ranch shimmered with new green leaves. The scars of the long winter still remained if one knew where to look, but life had already begun writing over them. A week earlier, the county sheriff had ridden into the valley with 2 federal marshals. Harlan's testimony had opened the door. Daniel Bell's ledger had finished the job. The final piece of evidence had been hidden exactly where Daniel believed no one would ever think to search. Sewn inside the lining of Lucy's old coat was a folded list of names, payment records, and signatures connecting Silas Vane to every burned barn, poisoned creek, and fraudulent land purchase along the Continental Passage route. Daniel had hidden the page there before his death, trusting that no outlaw would think to search the clothing of a little girl. Silas was arrested before he ever reached another railroad camp. Continental Passage quietly abandoned its claim to the valley. For the first time in months, Blackthorn belonged entirely to the people who loved it. One warm afternoon, Caleb asked Mara to meet him beneath the old cottonwood overlooking the north pasture. Emma, Samuel, Lucy, Amos, and every ranch hand pretended to be busy nearby, though not one of them was truly working. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and placed a heavy iron key in Mara's hand. "The house." She looked up in surprise. "And the ranch?" Mara smiled gently before closing his fingers back around the key. "I don't want you to give it to me." Caleb frowned. "You don't." She shook her head. "I don't want Blackthorn to belong to one person." He waited. "I want it to belong to a family." She looked across the ranch where Samuel and Emma were racing toward the creek, while Lucy chased after them, laughing so hard she could barely keep up. "If we're building a future here," her eyes met his, "then I want us to own it together." Caleb felt the corners of his mouth lift for the first time in days. "Partners," she smiled. "Equal partners." After a brief silence, she added one more request. "And one more thing. Anything. My children will never grow up feeling like guests." She glanced toward Emma, who had already slipped her hand into Samuel's as naturally as breathing. "They're sisters now." Her voice grew softer. "They're all our children." Caleb didn't answer with words. He simply took her hand. This time, neither of them let go. The wedding took place beneath that same cottonwood a month later. Wildflowers covered the meadow, where snowdrifts had once stood. Amos insisted on wearing his oldest Sunday suit. Harlan, finally free of the guilt he had carried for so long, stood quietly among the ranch hands. Emma scattered handfuls of yellow flowers down the aisle, while Lucy proudly carried the rings in a little wooden box Samuel had carved himself during the spring. When the minister finally asked Caleb if he accepted Mara as his wife, he smiled before answering. "I already did." Laughter rolled across the pasture. Moments later, as husband and wife walked back toward the ranch, with 4 children running ahead of them, the afternoon sun settled over Blackthorn like a blessing. The land Daniel had died trying to protect had finally become the home he had hoped his family would one day find. The first warm days of summer brought more than green pastures to Blackthorn Ranch. They brought travelers. Families moving west stopped for water before crossing the next valley. Ranchers traded horses at the corrals. Children chased chickens across the yard while their parents rested beneath the cottonwoods. Little by little, Blackthorn became known for something beyond its cattle. It became known for kindness. One quiet afternoon, Mara was kneading bread in the ranch kitchen, while Emma helped Lucy hang fresh laundry outside. Samuel and Caleb were repairing a gate along the south pasture when the sound of hesitant footsteps reached the porch. A woman stood beside the front gate. Her dress was faded almost white from dust and sun. A little boy clung to her hand, his face thin from too many days on the trail. Behind them waited an old wagon pulled by a tired mule. The woman removed her hat. "I'm sorry to trouble you." Mara stepped onto the porch. "How can I help?" The stranger lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed. "We've been traveling for 3 days." She hesitated before continuing. "My son hasn't had fresh milk since we left Cheyenne." The little boy tried to smile, though his stomach answered first with a quiet growl. For a heartbeat, Mara was no longer standing on the porch of Blackthorn Ranch. She was back at the front gate months earlier, holding Lucy's hand while Samuel stood silently beside her. Cold, hungry, frightened, asking one impossible favor. "Please, just 1 cup of milk." The memory passed as quickly as it had come. Mara smiled. "Wait here." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying not a cup, but a large stoneware jug filled to the brim with fresh milk. She placed it gently into the woman's hands. The traveler's eyes widened. "This is too much." Mara shook her head. "No." She looked down at the little boy, then smiled in the same gentle way someone once should have smiled at her. "No child leaves Blackthorn hungry." The woman could no longer hold back her tears. She whispered a quiet thank you before leading her son back toward the wagon. The little boy turned around twice, waving excitedly until the road disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. Only then did Mara realize she was no longer standing alone. Caleb had come up behind her without making a sound. He rested one hand lightly against the porch post and watched the wagon disappear down the road. Then he looked at Mara. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. A quiet smile was enough. Mara slipped her hand into his. Together they stood beneath the summer sky, watching another family leave with hope instead of fear. Winter had not only tested Blackthorn Ranch, it had tested a promise spoken at the front gate on a late autumn afternoon. Mara kept her promise when she saved Caleb's land. Caleb kept his. Not with a cup of milk, but by bringing Mara and her children safely home through the storm. And from that day forward, Blackthorn was no longer the place people ran to escape winter. It became the place where they finally found a home.